Hi, this is the Nuclear Humanist, and I am Matthijs Bekkers. This week a subscriber asked whether I could make a response to Robert Llewellyn's video called Wind, Nukes and Oil. For those who don't know, Robert is the host of an online show called Fully Charged, which has been awesome for a while, until he began showing a weird bias against nuclear power. Mostly, he talks about electric vehicles, which I like, but when he talks about how we generate energy, he somehow starts waffling away. Let's see what he had to say.
Hello and welcome to another news episode of Fully Charged. There's so much news in the world of renewables and electric cars that it's just impossible to keep up. I get literally hundreds of updates every day from around the world.
Let's freeze this frame for a second. Could it be that you misunderstand nuclear energy? I mean, if you're already struggling to keep up with the news, I would get that you would cut some corners about subjects which are considered less popular. Perhaps being obsessed isn't such a good thing.
Now you could say this is because I'm completely obsessed, or you could say that it's because there is a genuine shift going on. Despite the best efforts of one or two governments around the world, the technological advances, the massive installation and the constantly decreasing cost all point to a heavily renewable future.
This is not true. All it shows is that many people have not done the correct calculations yet, and this includes policymakers and even academics. Besides, can we determine what you mean by massive installation or constantly decreasing costs? It is tempting to use these as arguments, but substantiation of these claims is clearly lacking. Let's see what the installation rate actually is, and if we can call this massive. First, here we have a projection by the United States Energy Information Administration. It shows us that primary fuel consumption can grow up to 800 quadrillion BTU by 2040. This is the equivalent of 250,000 terawatt hours. Grouped together, nuclear and renewables don't even constitute 1/4 of the total energy mix. As you can see, most of it is still coal, gas and oil, well up to the 2040s. Here we see a graph from the same data set. However, this only shows world electricity generation up until 2040. As you can see, the United States Energy Information Administration projects that renewables reach between 10 and 12,000 terawatt hours of electricity generation. This of a total 250,000 terawatt hours required. This tells us that renewable energy is only 5% of the entire primary energy demand of the world population by 2040. This is counter to the claim of massive installation. We have now arrived at the final graph from the same dataset with which we began. We may note that hydropower still remains the largest source of renewable energy. Only 2,500 terawatt hours are allotted for wind and solar energy, which against the backdrop of 250,000 terawatt hours looks totally insignificant. In all fairness, current additions of wind and solar are roughly worth 220 terawatt hours per year. If we would keep this up, we would reach 2,500 terawatt hours by 2029, which is 11 years earlier than the EIA foresees. So there's a margin of error present in their prediction. Suppose we keep the rate of 220 terawatt hours added per year. We would reach 250,000 terawatt hours by the year 3100. This tells us that we need to at least increase production capabilities by 20 times in order to make it before 2050. Now that's a tall order. If you take a look at this graph, you will see how much our current production rate is trailing behind what it should be in order to reach deep decarbonization using wind and solar alone. It might not seem like much, but consider this. We need to increase material production rates for copper, lithium, cobalt, silicates, boron, phosphorus, and rare earth materials and the such like by equally large amounts. And this won't come for free, nor free from emissions, nor free from environmental damage.
Now, I recently learned that the now defunct Department of Energy and Climate Change, otherwise known as DEC, spent 80 to 90% of its annual budget on decommissioning nuclear power plants and dealing with radioactive toxic waste.
These are meaningless buzzwords, since you do not provide any context. What do you mean with radioactive and toxic waste? Can you describe them? Do you know how it is stored? Do you know how much it is? Do you know whether it is dangerous and in what kind of context?
We're currently looking at a bill of £54 billion to pay for the decommissioning of our current array of nuclear power stations in this country. £54 billion. Of course, cleaning up this lot isn't paid for by the power companies. I mean, they're not stupid. No, we pay for that. We, the numpty taxpayer.
Yet you make it seem that the British didn't have any benefit from it at all, which is false.
Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because recently one of the world's first offshore wind farms was decommissioned. Just off the southeast coast of Denmark, 11 wind turbines have been dismantled after 25 years of service. Now, these turbines, which are titchy in comparison with the massive machines we put offshore now, have been described as the cradle of offshore wind. It was through studying how they behaved, how they survived storms, how much energy they generated, that have allowed us to develop offshore wind in such a big way. A single version of the latest turbines produces more energy than all 11 of these original ones. And how much does it cost to decommission and remove old offshore wind turbines? Well, according to a paper published by the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, it costs about 2 to 3% of the original capital cost of the wind turbines, which, in layman's terms, is sod all.
So, let's add some perspective to this argument. How much energy is produced over the lifespan of these power stations, and how much money could you get from the consumer? Great Britain has about 9,500 megawatts of nuclear capacity spread over 15 reactors. These reactors are all expected to run for about 40 years. Given a capacity factor of 90%, these reactors would generate almost 3 trillion kilowatt hours over 40 years. At a price of 12 pence per kilowatt hour, that would be 360 billion British pounds of income. However, most reactors run for 60 years, which brings us to a total electricity income of 540 billion pounds. Let's compare this with offshore wind, shall we? Suppose you would build 9,500 megawatts of offshore wind capacity. It would run for about 25 years. That would get you 624 billion kilowatt hours, and that's 75 billion pounds of income. Compare this to 540 billion pounds with the same capacity in nuclear energy. So there you have it. The nuclear power plants easily outclass offshore wind by a factor of 5 to 7 in terms of economic worth on a per megawatt capacity basis. That's because wind turbines fail to return on their investment for 70% of the time and only operate for 25 to 30 years. Thank goodness that their decommissioning costs are so low, otherwise none of them would ever be built. And yes, I am honest, we need nuclear, wind and solar to work together rather than against each other, as you would make it seem. If decommissioning and keeping spent fuel costs £54 billion for the UK, the decommissioning itself may cost a lot of money, but it also creates jobs. That's why it costs a lot of money. According to Green Dogma, creating jobs is good, even though they might not create a lot of energy. The difference is, with wind turbines and solar panels, you create a lot of jobs for little return in terms of energy, especially when compared to nuclear power. Another missed consideration: spent fuel is worth its money in gold. There are still masses of energy in there in the form of unused uranium-238 fuel, so it would seem wise to spend some money on keeping it around.
Now, what do you do with the materials in these wind turbines? Well, you just use them again.
This is not true, and you are misleading your viewers. The concrete almost always isn't used again. After 25 years of having to withstand wind and water forces, these concrete foundations, if they are concrete, are mostly left, and doing anything with them will cost more energy. So either you let them stay where they are, or you pulverize them and use them for gravel paths and the such like. What about the large steel pillars? Again, material stresses prohibit us from using them again, so repurposing them means recycling them, i.e. chopping them up, sticking them in a large melting machine and investing a lot of energy to get a nice new virgin slab of steel again. Where do you suppose this energy comes from? Solar? Wind? I will put my money on fossil fuels. What about the rotors? The blades. They are made of fiberglass composite materials. You cannot reuse these after you pull them off the wind turbine. And since they are made out of fiberglass, you either have to shred them or leave them somewhere, because there's nothing else you can do with it, really. Remember, wind turbines have a finite lifespan. This lifespan is determined by the amount of stress the materials they are made of can bear.
Yeah, but do you need to bury any of the waste products and then protect them for 10,000 years?
All the irrelevant and exotic materials that comprise a wind turbine come from China, where they are being mined and refined. All the residual elements and chemicals are simply being chucked into a lake. Aside from that, 94% of this so-called waste is uranium-238, which we can use to create more power. We only use about 6% of the total uranium fuel to create energy, which means that if we were to use new reactors that can make use of U-238, and we would do it at the same rate we've used the fuel in the old reactors, we would have about 800 years of nuclear fuel for Great Britain in spent fuel alone. Not to mention millions of years from the uranium that hasn't been mined or can be extracted from the sea. Yes, that is right. The sea is radioactive, thanks to the uranium, thorium, and potassium that flow up from the planet's core into the upper crust, thanks to plate tectonics. Newer reactors, like the Russian BN-800, can use U-238 to create energy, and the waste, it is stored effortlessly in dry cask storage containers after they have cooled down in wet storage. These containers are so incredibly dangerous that you can see people standing next to them taking pictures with it. Silly me, I meant safe. People clearly don't understand the nature of this so-called waste. It is a slightly hot ceramic. It doesn't do anything except emit the occasional gamma, beta, or alpha particle. And that's why we store this fuel in these thick concrete casks. But other than that, nothing spectacular happens with it. We are also working on liquid fuel reactors, which are incredibly versatile and can create energy from thorium and uranium, depending on the configuration. We will be increasing fuel efficiency dramatically, and we will also stop producing long-lived radioactive waste. Besides, nuclear waste isn't that dangerous. In fact, it is tiny in risk compared to the everyday emissions from fossil fuel combustion.
And what about the energy that's used to produce them in the first place? Now, I've heard from many people on Twitter that in fact it takes more energy to build a wind turbine than it ever produces in its entire life. An interesting notion which, if I can say as politely as possible, is utter bollocks. It takes, according to EDF Energy, who aren't exactly a bunch of tree-hugging libtards, between 3 and 6 months for a wind turbine to produce more electricity than it ever took to manufacture it in the first place, and they have a lifespan of between 25 and 30 years.
I won't dispute that wind turbines produce more energy than they cost. We should look at this question from the perspective of efficiency, however. Here we see a small scientific model from Professor Per Peterson from Berkeley University in California. Professor Peterson has discovered that nuclear needs about 216 kilograms of materials per kilowatt of capacity. A wind turbine requires more than double, with 542 kilograms per kilowatt of capacity. But that's not all. We want to know how efficient this material usage actually is. So we create two models. A 1000 megawatt wind facility with a capacity factor of 30% and a 1000 megawatt nuclear facility with a capacity factor of 90%. We assume a lifespan of 30 years for the wind turbines and a lifespan of 60 years for the nuclear facility. During operation, the nuclear facility produces 6 times more electricity than the wind facility does. The wind facility fails to return on its investment for 70% of the time. So now we divide the total yield by the amount of materials invested and discover that wind delivers 145 kilowatt hours per kilogram of materials invested, while nuclear gives us 2192 kilowatt hours per kilogram, making it 15 times more efficient in terms of materials put to good use.
And while I'm gassing on about wind and renewables, last year Sweden produced 57% of all its electricity from wind and hydro.
And yet you forget to mention that the rest came from nuclear energy, which they used to provide baseload power for themselves and for all of their neighbors. Also note that there is still 15% of fossil fuels being burned in Greater Scandinavia, including Latvia, Estonia and Lithuania, and that it is rather naive to suppose that wind and hydro will offset this. In fact, most of the renewable energy comes from hydro, and hydro, in all honesty, isn't a clean source of energy and not scalable either. Finally, check out the energy balance. They are importing energy in Scandinavia, which means that hydro and wind are insufficient. Even nuclear is insufficient at this moment. So to suppose that wind turbines can pick up the slack is a rather unrealistic assumption.
They've just announced that they will be 100% renewably powered by 2040, when all their existing setup of nuclear power stations are finally decommissioned. At enormous expense, no doubt. And the reason they're replacing nuclear with wind and hydro? Because it's cheaper.
This is a baseless assumption, and I would not bet on it. Besides, I have just shown you the most critical aspect in energy generation, and that is material efficiency. Robert Llewellyn would do better if he accepted that nuclear and renewables are the only two sources of energy which could be as carbon neutral as possible. However, as he discards nuclear energy, he is inadvertently proposing some sort of combustion to offset the intermittency of renewables. And this stems from the fact that we also don't produce enough storage, let alone enough wind and solar energy to store in the first place. Apart from the fact that renewables simply cannot do it all. This has become the pervasive green movement narrative. It is dogma. I would like to advise you to adhere to the principles of humanism and free thinking, and don't follow these anti-nuclear individuals and movements blindly. If you value the lives of humans all around the planet and want to minimize human suffering, it is completely logical to advocate for nuclear power, as it is the only, and I repeat, only source of energy which has proven to be able to punch out coal and gas, as it has done so in France, Sweden, Belgium, Germany and Japan, without any ill side effects except for the pervasive and unsubstantiated fear-mongering from certain activist groups and media. In fact, I assert that this anti-nuclear sentiment is one of the reasons why climate change is getting out of hand. It creates an elephant in the room. The German energy transition has proven that you cannot supplant nuclear with renewables. In fact, biomass burning and lignite coal have replaced nuclear in Germany, while they only added 5% of renewable energy to their entire energy mix, which is more than just electricity alone. But that doesn't mean that we don't need renewables either. We need both nuclear energy and renewables to be on top of their game. We have a really big problem on our hands, and it is high time that people like Robert Llewellyn start to acknowledge that and leave the anti-nuclear dogma where it belongs, in the trash bin.